usually think they were so obsessed by death. But if you look into the tombs through the whole Egyptian history, what you see are depictions of life. So in a way, it would be better to say the ancient Egyptians were obsessed by life and its continuation beyond death. The museum was able to acquire this Tomb of Perneb in 1913 from the Egyptian government. Then the museum sent its crew, which was also the excavation crew, with Albert Lisko as the head, to the place. They took a lot of photographs. We have a whole series of these marvelous photographs of that time. They removed slowly the debris around the tomb. And block by block, the tomb was taken apart. And then it came to New York, and it took 3 years till 1916 to reconstruct it in the museum, in the place it is now. From its opening, it became quite a New York monument. There are some cartoons just after it had opened, where you can see how people immediately reacted to this ancient monument here. The unique point about Perneb is the amount of architecture that the museum was able to acquire with the tomb chapel. You have to realize what we have is a lot of architecture, but it is mainly the front half of this original mastaba, as we call it. So in a way, the Metropolitan is the only place to see the architecture of an Old Kingdom tomb outside Egypt. If we want to go back into Perneb's time, we have really to go more than 4,000 years back, about 2,350, 30 BC. So we are here in what we call the Old Kingdom, the time of the great pyramid builders. Perneb was an official who functioned in the presence of the pharaoh.
Perneb's essential function was to be the king's dresser, the king's valet, if you want. The king was the focal point of Egyptian society. He was the link between the world of people and the world of the gods. The king, unlike every other human being, was also clothed with the symbols of kingship, crowns and scepters and so forth. It was somebody's job to take care of these instruments, this regalia, and to actually put them on the king in the morning. In Perneb's time, that was Perneb.
So that gives him quite a high standing in the hierarchy.
The ancient Egyptians expended more energy and more money on creating tombs like Perneb's than they did on their own houses while they were alive.
You have to realize that in ancient Egypt, you started making your tomb as soon as you were able to. So in a way, like today, one starts one pension fund or something, they started their tomb.
Very few ancient Egyptians could afford a tomb like Perneb's.
So let us imagine the Old Kingdom. Saqqara was the main royal and non-royal cemetery for the capital of Egypt, which during the Old Kingdom and later was a place called Memphis by the Greeks. The tomb of Perneb was situated to the north of the great step pyramid of King Djoser in that huge cemetery of Saqqara. It was like entering into another village with the streets and the monuments, but now you would be in the city of the dead. Underneath, there's the burial chamber with a shaft dug deep into the ground. The tomb of Perneb is called a mastaba, a massive box, you could say, of limestone, which has inclined sides. The mastaba with its courtyard and chapel and rooms remained the accessible part of the tomb where the family and friends could come to perform the rites and bring offerings. In the middle of the mastaba superstructure, there was the shaft that cut deep into the bedrock and led finally into the burial chamber. When the mummification was done, the mummy was lowered through the shaft into the burial chamber and deposited in the massive stone sarcophagus. Here in the burial chamber were the 4 canopic jars at the foot of the sarcophagus, jars that contain the organs that were removed from the mummy during mummification, miniature vessels that were deposited during the burial are not real vessels. They are magical substitutes for large vessels and their contents. After all these rituals were completed, the priests and workers climbed back up the shaft using little cut-out niches, like a staircase. The shaft was then filled with rubble, and finally the burial chamber was sealed for eternity.
The ancient Egyptian idea of the afterlife was that an individual would continue to live, but as a spirit, not as a physical body. As a living being, like all living beings, it needed a place to stay. And this is what the tomb was. It's like a house. The burial chamber below ground is the bedroom. This is where the spirit sleeps at night. In the morning it wakes up, it comes out of the bedroom into the public rooms of the house, which are what we call the chapel. So Perneb was never buried in the building that we have here in the museum. These are the public rooms of his house. His burial chamber is still in Egypt. To the ancient Egyptians, the world was peopled not only by the physical beings that they could see, but also by the spirits of the deceased. The world of what we call the dead was part of the world of the living in ancient Egyptian times.
So let us imagine the family. They came to this tomb after he was dead and buried in his deep down burial chamber. And they would have come through this narrow lane into the entry. And first through a little vestibule without decoration, you just see the marvelous large stones. Then you come into this courtyard, open to the sky. You came into the courtyard as you would come into the courtyard of a farmhouse. This was really an intimate space. Family would have brought food in the way of offerings. They would have brought vegetables, meat, fish, fowl, all nicely prepared.
Because the Egyptians realized that food and drink have something to do with life. So what they're presenting in the offerings is the life force. When they enter the tomb chapel of Perneb, they would see what's known as a false door. It's the focal point of every tomb. It's made out of stone, and it doesn't open, but it represents a real doorway. After waking up, the spirit comes out of the burial chamber and through the false door partakes of the life force in the food, and then proceeds through the tomb to the world of the living. You go into the tomb of Perneb, you will see images of Perneb facing outward because his spirit is coming out of the false door. And you see images of the living going into the tomb towards the false door. Most of the images are scenes of offering bearers, people bringing in the kind of lavish meal that ideally everyone would want, whether in this world or in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians had no word for art. All the reliefs and the sculptures and the paintings that we call Egyptian art, all of it served a purpose. But its purpose was not to be beautiful. Its purpose was to be functional.
The decoration is fundamentally there to make sure that this bringing of food really takes place. Egyptians believed firmly in that what is there as depiction is real. All those people who walk towards Perneb with their food offerings, there's so much to observe about how they carry and what is there. On the wall opposite the false door, we have this glimpse into a butcher's shop. And of course, they are producing the meat for the offerings, but at the same time, we really can see how this shop worked. Some of the inscriptions tell us what these butchers say to each other. So one said, cut it off. The other one says, I'm doing this to your satisfaction, and so on. So we even have a little possibility to hear their voices.
Perneb's tomb also has, to the side of what we call the offering chamber, the main focal point of the tomb, there's another room which is not decorated, but it was also a place for offerings. There's a slot in the wall. Behind this slot, in what Egyptologists call the serdab, stood a statue of the deceased, looking out into the offering chamber, seeing the people who came to leave offerings. There's a wall there. You can see the image, but you can't get to it. It's really a psychological tool for the living. You may believe with all your heart and know even that someone you loved is still alive in spirit form, and yet you just can't touch them, you can't contact them, because they're no longer physically in the world.
First thing you have to remember is that this was not one artist, one big genius artist, but these were groups of people. Groups of people who saw themselves more as artisans and craftsmen than artists, which is a term that didn't really exist. And there was a first group that would come, surely under the supervision of somebody who was literate, who would sketch out in black or red ink how they thought this whole thing should come out. They would indicate by lines, straight lines, the height of the shoulder and the height perhaps of the knees or the elbows. And we have that in the vestibule of the tomb. And then the next group would come, and that's the group of the sculptors, who would start first removing the background between the sketched figures. They would start sculpturing the interiors of the figures with all these beautiful indications of the musculature. And that's the real, what we might say, the creative moment of making this art. And of course, then the last stage is the painters come, and they paint what has been sculpted, and only then it is finished. The tomb is in this way of having only the sketches in the front room. The tomb is unfinished to a certain degree. It was clearly used, the person was buried, and we have to assume that he died perhaps sooner than he had thought. And that then it was more or less said, well, that's it. Let's leave the vestibule as it was.
Inside the tomb, Perneb, where the altar is located, that glass had been installed in 1916 and had not been changed, modified, or adjusted in any way. And you know, the pioneering concept of glass in front of the walls in 1916 left us with very dark green glass in the 1990s.
So that glass had to come down. And then a thorough conservation work was done over almost a year by conservators of the museum. And that was our first thrust, of course, into this project. In thinking this through with among the designers, curators, and the architects, we really came to the conclusion that we should not, at this point, only renovate and preserve, do something for the preservation of the decoration, but we should rethink the way the museum is presenting this unique monument. Since 1916, a lot has happened in our understanding of Egyptian art. During all these years, when you came into our first gallery of Egyptian art, you were confronted by this monumental facade of the tomb. For the Old Kingdom, this is wrong, because Old Kingdom architecture did not show its monumentality by opening a facade towards the viewer. It was closed in.
So as the years went on, everyone kept questioning what to do with the tomb, how to make it look more appropriate to the site that it was excavated from, to give it the reference that it really should have had. We started looking at all the excavation photographs, looking at the details of the construction of the walls. The tomb that was on the face of the Perneb tomb had a massive wall right up against where Perneb was.
So we thought we would put up a wall, but we would show that wall in a ruined state. After all, this is a 4,000-year-old monument. So the ruined state is a very natural state for it.
A theater set production person from the opera made us a full-scale foam mock-up of this wall. Because we looked at it and we realized this looks like the Flintstones here. And when Philippe walked in, he looked at it and said, if this turns out to be Disney, forget it. You're not putting this wall up.
That wall that we were putting in here and adding newly to the monument had to be as authentic as possible.
We were in Egypt and we went out looking in the desert to try to find around the step pyramid in Saqqara where the Perneb remains were. And it's probably one of the most exciting adventures in all my years of traveling with curators, because here was Dorothea running twice as fast as me, up and down the knolls and hills of sand near the step pyramid, and all of a sudden she turns around and says, it's over there, it's over there. We run over and boom, there is the tiny little fragment of the wall left sticking up out of the sand dune. And I said, that is it, we've actually found the corner of the wall. Then we had to find just the right example of how the wall would flake and break and crumble and pieces fall off naturally. And we actually found a wall, and that wall was exactly the kind we're looking for, which had two sides that were completely intact and the middle part that had been completely collapsed.
The second necessary step was to get sculptors who would know how to treat these stones, shape the surface in the ancient techniques. And we were very fortunate in being able to employ a sculptor, Danny Roy, who is very well versed in the ancient techniques.
And Danny brought us to a wonderful quarry that was the same quarry that the stones were excavated from for the original tomb. The stone was carved and shaped and actually stacked for us when we made a return trip and went to the quarry yard. Then the entire group of the factory ended up having to take the wall down block by block and crate each block and ship it here to New York. The fascinating part of watching Danny Roy and all of his associates working with him here in the galleries was that they were using original tools. It was the only way they could get the right effect and look of the stone.
You know what you can get? Oh, milk, baby. Still not like 7 stolen.
And the very simple way that they rigged the stone to lift it up and hoisted it up on top and set it in place, you know, except for the metal piping, it's the same thing that the ancient Egyptians would have done in wood. One of the most entertaining things that was happening as we were doing that, though, was everyone was very afraid, well, we don't want to touch the wall, we don't want to mess up the wall, we want to do anything to it. And I kept saying to them, break it, scratch it, mark it. I need scratches, I need chips falling out of this wall. I want this wall to look like it's been here a long time.
So one main point was we reopened the side entry so that people can now come again, as they would have done in ancient times, through that side entry. And so in the end, we hope we are not only showing a more cleaned and better preserved tomb, but we also wanted to show it as close to the original setting as we could get with our present understanding of this architecture.
In a sense, the recent renovation of Perneb's tomb reflects the kind of renovation, the intellectual renovation that we've had in Egyptology in understanding what this tomb is and what it means. It's not just a dead work of art, it's also a monument of a living human being and a living civilization.